one way that we understand literature is, of course, to analyze it and dissect it, and that has led into various forms of literary criticism. For example, I am a feminist critic, in that when I read works, I examine them in how they portray women, but also how women authors are perceived and have been perceived for hundreds of years, even thousands of years, if you want to go back to Sappho in Greek culture. For our purposes, and almost lost my train of thought there, for our purposes in this class, I do want to talk about aspects of criticism, literary criticism, that changed over the time of the Victorian era into modern times, and how that affects how we examine literature from any era, but especially the Victorian era, because this is a class on Victorian literature. In the Victorian time period, Matthew Arnold was a well-known literary critic. But from the time the long stretch of Victoriana began until it ended, aspects began to change in not only how authors wrote and expressed themselves and what they expressed in their literature, but how literature was examined and criticized also changed. Now, the first module remarks about how these first poems that we are examining in that module are very personal, and they are very personal. And this personal aspects appearing in literature was not confined to poetry and was not confined to the early periods. Later, when we read Dickens, we're going to read Oliver Twist, but if you read other novels by Twist, by Dickens, they are very autobiographical, and not only are, from the point of view of how Dickens was formed as a child. His father went to debtor's prison, and in those days, the whole family went to prison, debtor's prison. And this aspect of poverty and of just wretchedness is reflected in so many of his works, and they're often very bleak, and they are very condemnatory. I knew I'd get that word out, of the society of the time. But that did change over time and became maybe less autobiographical, even though I really truly think, as a creative writer, that even though we are not expressing I in novels, and neither was Dickens, it still is works are largely autobiographical in one sense or another. But that's just my personal opinion, and it doesn't apply to all literature. But back to the criticism, which is what I really wanted to talk about. When the Victorian era began, it was an era of old historicism. And that meant that when somebody looked at a work, a critic looked at a work, it was not just at the work itself, but the societal aspects and the author's biography. And I don't mean a biography from the point of view of an author, somebody writing about an author, or an author being autobiographical, but the author's life and experience was definitely used in examining and dissecting a work. So when we look at Dickens' work from a historicism critic's point of view, we would say, yes, Dickens' life definitely affected his writing and the experiences that he experienced as a child, had a huge influence on what he chose to write about, how the characters are portrayed, and again, just permeated his works, as did these poems that we see by Arnold and Tennyson in this first module. As time progressed, though, formalism came into vogue, and formalism said a work is closed. When you read a work, you're only examining the work itself. The author's life and those types of aspects, even the society, doesn't really matter because it is the work in and of itself that one has to examine and dissect in order to understand it. And then new criticism, which comes directly out of formalism, started in the 30s and 40s, and it said the same thing. You can only examine what is written on the page. The author's life doesn't matter, just what is on the page. And I went to college in the 1970s. Yes, I'm old. I got my master's degree in the 90s, but I did all my undergrad work in the 70s. And new criticism was still in full force by then. The 60s changed it somewhat, and in that people began to examine aspects of the author's lives again. But when I was in community college and even getting my bachelor's degree, my professor said, no, you need to examine the work and only the work. Don't bring any aspect of the author into that. That was beginning to change, though, by the time I did get my bachelor's degree in 1977. And I do remember writing a paper about the poetry of Robinson Jeffers and Walt Whitman. And yeah, I did examine their lives somewhat. But again, the emphasis was on the work itself. Today, I think that we have swung back the other way. And while we need to be very careful, especially in poetry, and in this will apply to the Victorian era, and I will explain why in a minute, in assuming, and that is a big word, that the author's, either the author's ideology, philosophy, or personal life comes into play in that work. Yes, with Dickens it did. Yes, with these early works by Matthew Arnold and Tennyson, definitely did. But consider Browning, Robert Browning. In another class I teach in literature, we read Browning's work. We read My Last Duchess and we read Porphyria's Lover. And it is very, very dangerous to assume in Browning's work that the thoughts or the ideas that are expressed, the action, let me say the action, not the thoughts or the ideas, the action in those poems to be considered autobiographical or promoting what Browning thinks about these. And if you're not familiar with these poems, My Last Duchess is a poem about a duke who is basically explaining to an envoy from we don't know who the envoy is representing, but is basically explaining to this envoy how he had his first wife killed because she was not did not live up to his expectation. And in Porphyria's Lover, the narrator of the poem kills this woman that he loves. He strangles her with her hair, and he strangles her with his hair, and nothing happens to him. And when I was taking a Victorian Lit course as a grad student, one of my peers in the classroom went ballistic on Browning, saying that he was a psychopath and a sociopath because he was advocating killing your wife. And that is not the gist of these poems. Remember, Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote to her husband, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways," which does not indicate that he was treating her poorly or had homicidal thoughts. So applying, taking what these narrators say in these poems and then evaluating them and saying that Browning was a psychopath has no validity. And what he is really doing in these poems is talking about how obsessiveness can lead to disaster. So, in one aspect, then, looking at Browning's life helps us understand that he wasn't crazy and he wasn't homicidal. And examining Dickens' life lets us know that he wrote about these social aspects, perhaps in large part, probably not, maybe not the only part, but in large part because of what he had experienced as a child. So, from historicism to formalism to new criticism, we have all sorts of criticisms now. Like I said, I am a feminist critic, and I do other types of criticism as well. But when I did my master's thesis, it was examining the work of women's writing, Mary Shelley and Virginia Woolf, and I examined women writing overall. And we read a couple of In Memoriam, and during the Renaissance, women didn't write a lot. Not saying they didn't write, but they didn't write a lot. But one of the proper formats for women to write were memoriams. So I'm going to stop there, but when you are writing your final projects, keep in mind different types of criticism, and keep in mind that it is fine to examine the author's life, but make sure that assumptions are not made. And that means you have to do research on that author in order to make those claims. And I truly am going to stop now. And sorry about my rambling. I did have some notes, but I don't write out my scripts. So sometimes you just get what you get.